Good evening and welcome to Zion's Banner. I see people already starting to show up, and I am excited about that. And so I know that sometimes there's a little bit of delay and people come in when they can, and sometimes they have to leave for various reasons. But a shout out to Slams in the house and Brother Steve's in the house. I'm really, really happy about that. And we did pick up a new subscriber. Now, you never know. There are a lot of stations out there, but it was really exciting for me to see that. And we go back and forth, and it's just the way it is. But, you know, the folks that really stick with us have really stuck with us, and I really appreciate that. That's something that speaks to my heart. Well, I do want to let you know that the infographic from tonight, I will talk more about, but I will be making that available. I'll give you directions on how to get that, because what I make is available to you guys generally, and I've been doing some cool stuff with infographics. That being said, it is time to go ahead and share the PowerPoint. So let's get there and hit the magic share screen here. We're excited about that. Let's go here. In just a second here, things look a little funny to me. So let me unfunny them. There we go. Always good to unfunny them before you share the screen. So let's get started here. Okay, there we go. That's there. The screen is shared. We're going to continue looking at some of the problems centered around the incarnation and Maimonides, who influenced Judaism. Why am I spending so much time with this? A lot of the Jewish people you're going to meet are more secularized, but understand that there's an ingrained sort of response to the incarnation, and the incarnation is not something we can take or leave. And so this raises real problems in dealing with Jewish people. And because there is crossover to Muslims, that also becomes important. And so this also, as another additional reason, a bonus, such a deal, also will lead into a possible discussion on Kabbalah. Have you ever wondered what in the world Madonna thinks she joined and what she thinks it is, and she doesn't know? And so I am working on digesting a lot of that material. And this is a really good, important apologetics thing. And what I'm excited about is the infographic gives us a methodology that we can apply to interrogating any premise or any sort of conclusion or worldview. It will look a little different, but this particular methodology is a lot of fun. And so here's where we're at. Here's where we're going to get. I'm going to switch the slide here. Okay. One of the things that you have to know, and you probably do, but some people tuning in may not be aware of, is that as I'm dealing with this topic, I am going to be treating the temple as an extension of the tabernacle, because that's really what it is. Now, it represents a departure from the original instructions given in Moses, but it is permitted both by God, who allows Solomon and really gives Solomon the sort of design for it, as a change from the original tabernacle, which, by the way, proves that Torah changes, because if you just followed the instructions for the tabernacle, you would not get to the temple. But I'm going to speak in them as them together, because they are sort of a continuity with each other, and the same basic points apply to both. So that's a caveat that will explain some of my methodology. And so that's just you kind of need to go that. I'm kind of defining my terms. Okay. Moses Maimonides is a huge thinker, and he also imposes as a requirement for the Messiah that he will rebuild the temple. Now, Michael Brown deals with the fact that that is not necessarily a biblical requirement, but I want to let you know that Moses Maimonides is going to have several problems with the temple and the tabernacle on different levels. And one of them is going to be the sacrificial system, which he cannot regard the same way. Now, we're not going to handle that tonight, but it's important you understand that your Jewish friend is not necessarily awaiting a second temple so that atonement can take place. He may be awaiting a second temple, understanding the sacrificial system different than a pure necessity for atonement. So let's look at this. According to Maimonides, one of the ways Messiah will be recognized, this is one of the key reasons that he rejects Jesus, is he looks at these criteria that he himself has set up and says Jesus doesn't meet them. Now, a king will arise from the house of David who is learned in Torah and observant of the mitzvot, now, as prescribed in the written and oral law. Now, I want you to notice that Jesus is not overly thrilled with the traditions of the fathers, which is the proto Talmud, as we'd say, or the oral law. Jesus did not necessarily respect the oral law. The Torah does not state there's any overall law, but in the mind of Maimonides, there is both the written and the oral law, which is already problematic, as David, his ancestor, David never followed the oral law because the oral law didn't exist. And it will compel all of Israel to walk in the way of Torah. So one of the key purposes of Messiah is to enforce Old Testament law in the mind of Maimonides and reinforce its breaches and fight the wars of God. We may with assurance consider him the Messiah. If he succeeds in the above and builds the temple in its place and gathers the dispersed of Israel, he will be identified as the Messiah. So from Maimonides' point of view, rebuilding the temple is key. And why am I putting this up there? Because Maimonides really believes that there needs to be a temple. But why? Why is the temple important if God does not localize himself there? What is the purpose of this temple? And so we're going to look at this in terms of Maimonides' pure conviction that God cannot enter into his creation and localize himself or take form. Now we get to the incredible chart here, and I'm going to actually open this. I'm using Xmind, which really can do some cool stuff, and so I'm going to put Xmind up there for a second. Now you can kind of see it with this, but I want to make the face bigger here, and makes the picture bigger for you. And then I'm going to go ahead and share, and I'm going to stop sharing the other thing because I have to do that. You cannot just switch items. That is a cool feature for them to consider for the future. So I put this up here. I did put it up there, share screen. There we go. Now this is the flow chart, and I'm flow charting the argument. Now the question I'm asking myself is that Maimonides has to take the language related to the temple and God being present there as figurative. That's what he does. That's what he says. That's where he's at. So if we can do this, we can chart out an argument and look at the possibilities and then examine the evidence for each of the possibilities if the argument is true or if the argument's false. And we can flow chart it and we can see where it gets us. Now, on the side of if the argument's true, that the language is merely metaphor, then we have two other questions, which I've not fully developed yet. Does the temple serve an actual purpose, and how do we understand this historic passages? Now, we've discussed this a little bit in the past, but we haven't examined down the line yet. I'm going to go with the no side in the first large diamond-shaped thing here. If the language in the temple is not mere metaphor, okay, can I examine scriptures that indicate that it is metaphor and see that they are not to be understood that way? In other words, can I examine the verses that someone would pull to prove that this was only metaphor and demonstrate that they are not saying that? If I can demonstrate that there are no indications in specific passages that would normally indicate that God's dwelling among men was metaphoric in the Old Testament, mere metaphor, not actual, never happened, never occurred. If I can examine some specific passages that would be used that way, okay? If I can examine those passages and they don't say that, they don't say this is mere metaphor, even though someone says this is what they say, then I can say that if that were true, if yes, okay, that there are specific verses that prove that God could not have dwelt in the temple, they're only metaphoric, then it would be yes, that the language is metaphoric. In other words, if there are verses that cannot be defeated. Now, let me explain the term defeated or defeatable. If an argument is defeatable, it means that it can be wrong. Okay? Shout out back to Nate. I'm glad he's still with us, even though he's multitasking. He is an awesome guy because multitasking is difficult for me. That's why I love having two screens, because I can begin to multitask. And it's upped my ability to multitask. But that is another story. Okay. If there are verses that indicate that God's dwelling is merely metaphoric and they cannot be proven not to be taken that way, then I have to take those verses as saying that God dwelling in the temple is indeed a metaphor. And that would bring me over to this side of the argument here, which would mean that the language related to the temple of God dwelling is merely metaphorical. Now, I've cleaned up future charts because I can actually put the yes or no's on the arrows where it says relationship. But I'm still getting better at this. If that were true, then we have to examine the question as to what's in the historic passages, how are we to understand them? And how does the temple serve an actual purpose? Now, I want to let you know that this has actually been shown to the head of online evangelism at Chosen People, who is finishing his dissertation on something related to this. And he said this might be really useful for training. Stay at your chalkboard. I call my office and my study my chalkboard, and I call the streets where I go out to witness the laboratory. And he said, stay at the chalkboard. This looks really cool. So it needs work in order to go as far as I want to go. This is like the beginning of the chalkboard, okay? We're only going to get in this loop tonight, okay? The if no, and the 1A, and the if yes. And that's where we're going to go. Shout out to Elizabeth Oakman from down under. She is our international. I am so excited about that. This is our little loop here, okay, in this chart. And I'm going to make this chart available. Now, understand, I'm going to be making changes to this chart as I expand it out and do more stuff. But what this allows is we can thoroughly examine Moses Maimonides' premise that the language of God dwelling among us is totally false, and that's his premise for the incarnation being false, because if God can't take form, he cannot come as a man. And so we're examining this part of the argument here, which is our little loop chain that gets us back to this. We've not gone to this side. Okay? This is underneath this, because this, if it was different, would bring us back to the yes side. And some of these may bring us back to the yes side. So we're going to deal with that loop tonight. We're going to deal with that logical loop. So I need to go back here. Oh, look at that. I can just switch. I am so excited about that. There we go. And so there's our vital issue. There's this. Oh, I went the wrong way. That's my fault. There we go. Okay, let's go there. The if yes, what then? Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but you do need to know that this is a cool way to chart out arguments. You look at the questions that would arise if the other persons were true or false, and then you deal with proving the falsifying, or you deal with proving that the ramifications of the view are such that the view can't naturally, coherently follow. So something can end up in a position where it is internally coherent, but it is not coherent with all the other facts surrounding it. And this is the yes side. And this is for another night, but it's there. Now, just to go, I'm not proving any of this stuff, okay? But if I were to demonstrate the yes tonight, I would talk about the details of the construction of the tabernacle, indicating a literal dwelling. I would talk about the language of God taking residence, indicating a literal dwelling. I would talk about the issue that if these two indicate a literal dwelling and God literally taking precedence, and he cannot enter into his dwelling place because he cannot dwell anywhere, then the language related to the construction of the tabernacle and God taking residence can't be true. So it would have to be false. All those directions, if God can't take residence, but they indicate that God could take residence, would prove that those details are being stated in a way that is inaccurate, and the temple would serve no literal purpose. Now, Maimonides is not willing to say that, but that's where it goes. So let's talk about the key verse that indicates that the tabernacle was for God's dwelling. This is so important, both for apologetics and understanding your Old Testament. If you don't get this, you're missing the continuity, a major feature of the continuity in the biblical story. Okay, you are missing the richness of a key feature in biblical theology. Now, we all start the program where God is dwelling with man. He's visiting Adam and Eve in the garden. Okay, now Maimonides would say he walked in the garden is figurative language, and that's the way I grew up. When we get to Exodus, God says to Moses, "Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them according to all I show you. That is the pattern of the tabernacle and its furnishings, just as you shall make it." Now, what I want you to see here is that the purpose for making the tabernacle is listed with the command to make the tabernacle. Let me show this to you in Logos Bible. I'm going to bring this up. But I want you to see that linguistically, the purpose for the tabernacle and Moses making the tabernacle are directly linguistically connected in the Hebrew, okay? So here's our Hebrew language here, Ve'atzuli Mikdash, and this is the word for dwell. I will dwell among them, from the word sheken, right? And so there's our key word. There's just the I part. But I want you to see this part here. This is a vav conjunctive. Okay? Now, what a vav conjunctive is, it acts like a conjunction does in English. And, but, or. Okay? And what this conjunction does is it ties the purpose here of God dwelling among them to the making of the tabernacle. So linguistically, these two things are connected. Here's the command, okay? And this is actually in the imperative. Let me go here, okay? I'm sorry. What am I? I'm looking at the wrong thing. Let me go here. It isn't an imperative, but it has imperatival force. Now, that did kind of throw me a little, but you don't have to have a command necessarily be in the imperative. Now, when I go here, this is a Septuagint, okay? You have a future tense, which is interesting because there's nothing that indicates a future tense here, okay? But let them make, and you'll see the let there. Now, the let isn't there in Hebrew, but it's understood. This is kind of doing a thing with something called kind of a horatory. And so this is what you have. Rest assured, the context, okay, is a command. Let's just not get sloppy with it. The context is a command, and it's linguistically connected to the purpose. Now, see that is actually your vav conjunctive. But your vav conjunctive isn't being treated just, it's being treated as that. And it creates a conjunction between these two things. Now, why am I doing this? Because the command is linguistically connected to the purpose, and it is historically connected to the purpose. God is commanding this at a particular time with a specific purpose. So it is both linguistically and historically connected to what is, although not in an imperative form, is a command in its nature. And just a side note, it is real hot, real early in Phoenix. We had about 112, and even the evenings are hotter than usual. So that cool weather sounds really good. But that's just a kind of shout out. I'm actually watching something that's filmed in Australia on television, so maybe paying a little more attention to the climate there. So that's where we're at. Let's move back to the PowerPoint here. There we go. And so we have this clear purpose, okay? Now, does the word dwell there always occur figuratively? You know, if the word was always figurative, I would say, well, you know, that's just the way it is. I mean, the word is always figurative. So I looked up shechan, okay, which is used 128 times in the Old Testament, most often in the Kal. That's the simple form, which it was used there, and in the Piel 12 and the Hiphiel. Those are binyan. So for those of you who are studying Hebrew, this is the way you do it. You don't always have separate words. You have binyan or binyamim, and then you have the sharesh is the root. Now, this just tells me that in its simplest form, it occurs 111 times. In its causative form, it occurs 6 times. And if it in its intensive form, okay, and that's the way I'm treating PAO, kind of as an intensive, just to give you a feeling. It's more complicated than that, but you know, it's just the way it is. It occurs about 12 times. God is the subject 43 of those times. Look at Psalm 74:2, Exodus 25:8, Zechariah 12:3. And God has chosen to cause his name to dwell there. That's Deuteronomy 12:11. Now, when it refers to God dwelling there or localizing himself, okay, on occasions it can use a representative, symbolic representative of the divine presence. More often, the subject of the dwelling is the cloud. That's the Shekinah, okay? That's the way he's treating this. A shout out to Michelle. I'm not a quick typer, but I want to say hi. I'm so excited you're here. And Chris is here too. Thank you, Chris. That's just my hand at a quick typing. Okay. That's the way it starts. Now, can it be used figuratively? Well, we got to be honest with the text here. It can be used figuratively, but is it always used figuratively? Well, it's not always used figuratively. Okay, it can be, but it isn't always. So you can't say on the basis of the word itself that this is always figurative. What you can say is there are those places in which the context indicates it's figurative. Well, there you go. And there's a shout out to the Real Reviews, which are excellent apologetic reviews of movies. Me and Vocab did something like that once right after seeing Wonder Woman, and so you can go check that out. If Nate wants to throw the info, that's okay. We all work for the same king, and so he can go ahead and do that. Now, what's interesting is when you get to the Septuagint. Now, I don't poo-poo the Septuagint. It's not. It's a translation. There's some historic questions about, what some things got translated earlier. There were some glosses, but there really are versions of the Septuagint that are really good. And so there's shkenu, and it's used most often as kata shkenu rather than just skenu, a 2-to-1 ratio. And they're asking about the prefix. Now, in Greek, kata is a prefix, and you can attach the prepositions to the Greek words like you can in Hebrew, and you get an emphasis in the word, and Greek does that sometimes. The longer prefix should predominate is not totally clear. And they're saying, why not save yourself the ink here and just do the shorter form? And why would they take the longer form? And usually it's because of an emphasis, but they say that, it's not super clear, okay? But it lays emphasis on the idea of a longer or permanent stay. So here's the thing. It can be figurative, but when the Greek translates it, it indicates the longer stay. But why a longer figurative stay over a shorter figurative stay? And what would that mean anyway? I mean, there's no real sense to that, okay? Interestingly enough, the tabernacle, the mishkan, okay, or tabernacle, comes from the very word that is the verb for dwelling here. When you think tabernacle, think dwelling place. And it's very interesting because if this is figurative and the noun is taken from the verb that is to be understood figuratively, then you got this noun coming off this verb that is never to be understood literally, but the noun is to be understood literally. Why wouldn't the tabernacle be a figurative sort of thing in the narrative as opposed to a real construction? Now, obviously, there are details given that would lead us that way, but even taking the word from that verb seems to indicate something. Now, one of the things you can ask is, does somebody come to their position through their presupposition or through their honest weighing of the evidence? Now, we're all affected by presuppositions, but if the presupposition is driving the car, then the person isn't driving the car. So if there were no presuppositions, would you even bother to take it? And there's a question on the board. I will double back to it. It has to do with the concepts of abiding or dwelling. Okay? There begins with premises. Now, understand this. This is really cool because your Jewish friend has never been hit with the idea that really Maimonides is a real Greek kind of Jewish guy. I mean, we're not talking falafel here. We're talking gyro here. Okay? Maimonides begins with all sorts of premises from Greek thinking, particularly Neoplatonic and Neo-Pythagorean. Now, Neo-Pythagorean is a little harder for me to grasp. Because, and I'm getting my head around Neo-Pythagorean, but Plato believed the material was bad. Neoplatonic thinking is responsible for Gnosticism too. So what Maimonides is starting is with some presumptions. Now remember, he's hanging out in Cordoba, which is Islamic Cordoba, while the Muslims are busy translating Aristotle and Plato. And so he's Aristotelian, but he's Platonic Aristotelian, and he's getting all this stuff. And so he believed that the sages of Israel were, in fact, philosophers, which is really interesting because Isaiah never called himself a philosopher, and none of those guys ever looked like they thought of themselves as philosophers. The prophets of Israel received revelation directly from God. They did not philosophize their way to spiritual truth. Now, am I against philosophy? No, my degree is related to philosophy, but let's be honest about what prophets were. They conveyed philosophy through vision. So he thinks that they're philosophizing and they're conveying the information that they have gotten through being able to philosophize about God in a spiritually enlightened way. Okay, so they're real spiritually enlightened and they sense God's presence, and then they do philosophy and then they convey it in visions and parables. And of course, the greatest philosopher prophet is Moses. We're going to deal with that because Because why is Moses so great if God didn't visit him? Gave these ideas practical expression. So the ideas aren't directly, they're almost indirectly coming from God. He doesn't directly say that, but I got this from Dr. David Gillis, and he did a whole paper on the problem of sacrifice, Maimonides' Ladder of Enlightenment, and I have that paper and have read through it. And so this is the way he has it, and he said he disagreed with him in some fundamental ways. Now, he made use of the writings of Aristotle, but he isn't a complete Aristotelian. To reconstruct the correct, now look at this, get this. Now, I'm not getting it directly from Maimonides' writings, but I am getting it from the fact that the previous slide said so. To reconstruct the correct reading of the Bible and the sages, get this, to reconstruct the correct reading. The correct reading isn't there. He has to reconstruct it. In other words, this is all real highbrow visions and stuff, and he has to get at what it means, because you reading it would never get there. Okay, which has unfortunately been lost. So I didn't know that the Jewish people ever lost the correct reading of the Bible. The Bible doesn't seem to indicate that, but he would say that it's unfortunately been lost. The truth is one, and logic will take you there irrespective of ethnicity or tradition. Well, that last part is very agreeable, but the problem is you're starting with all this other Greek, Aristotelian, Platonic presupposition that isn't part of the Bible, and you're reading it through that lens. Okay? And you're starting with all these presuppositions. So if I start with a presupposition, it changes everything. And I always like to tell the frog story, and I haven't told the frog story for a while. And you know what? The frog story is very useful, so you can cite me with the frog story. Okay? There was a scientist that wanted to figure out how far frogs with, I almost want to feel like saying, stop me if you've heard this. But the scientist keeps cutting off legs to the frog and saying, jump, and it jumps less and less far. And then finally, he writes in his journal that frogs with legs can't hear. And the problem is that your presuppositions get in the way. And this is what sort of happened here. And so the answer is, if he didn't have the presuppositions, would he arrive at the conclusion? And there are reasons that he will use, okay, and others will use. Now, I don't know if he particularly uses 2 Chronicles. He does a lot of logical stuff on how if God is bigger than the universe, he could, you could never understand this. And so logically, if you think that it says what it says, it's because you didn't understand it to begin with, which is like convoluted thinking to me anyway. Because if it doesn't say what it says, then the people didn't understand it until later on. But here's a verse that someone would use. Okay, they'd go to 2 Chronicles, they'd say, okay, now remember our triangle. If we cannot defeat verses that seem to indicate that the language is merely metaphorical, then we have to assume that it's probably metaphorical. So let's take these verses and see if we're stuck with the idea it's metaphorical, or whether we can look at these verses and come to the conclusion that they are not saying that the language is merely metaphorical, which allows us not to go back to, yes, the language is metaphorical. Okay, I will get to that question, Chris. Will God indeed dwell with men on earth? Behold, the heavens and the heavens of heavens cannot contain them. How much less the temple which I have built? And so someone says, hey, look, I have proof that God never, ever localized himself in the ancient temple. And therefore, it is obvious that he could not localize himself by taking on a human nature and becoming a man, because he can't do that. And look at this verse. It says that God cannot dwell on earth with men. And so Jesus could not dwell on earth with men, because Jesus dwelling on earth with men would be like more compact than the tabernacle. Okay? And so that's what they do. Well, can God indeed dwell? The heavens of heavens cannot contain him. And so I looked at the word contain. Okay? Cool. I believe that's Vav is dotted in the center. Sorry about that. There is no vowel mark. Okay, and most often it's translated as contain, occasionally provide. Okay, holding or sustaining can be used, like you're containing something, you're keeping You're sustaining the dam by containing the water. Okay, sort of thing. Okay? Solomon's statement is not about whether God can localize himself and take form. Solomon's statement is that the temple cannot contain all of God. It means that all of God is and all of who God is cannot be held in the mere frame of the tabernacle. But the word does not indicate that God cannot localize himself. See, when I'm looking at the verse, I cannot say more than the verse says. The verse doesn't say that. The verse says that the tabernacle is not big enough for all of an infinite God to get into, not that God can't choose to localize himself in that space through taking on some sort of form. Doesn't say that. Now, your average Jewish person is not going to turn to Stephen's speech. Some Muslim might turn to Stephen's speech, and some Jewish polemicists like Atovia Singer might turn to Stephen's speech, because he could then argue that the New Testament disagrees with itself. It says Jesus became God and he took on a form, but Stephen is very clear that God could not localize himself. And so he would go to Stephen's speech in Acts 48 through 50. It starts with, however, the Most High does not dwell in temples made by hands, as the prophet says. The heaven is his throne and the earth is his footstool. What house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or what is the place of my rest? Is your hand not made all these things? And, oh, slam dunk here. We've got it. We're totally destroyed. Well, that's not true. As Conrad, and I'm not going to try to, commentator here in the Acts commentary. By the way, I don't get my theology from commentaries, but sometimes commentary guys have gotten some theology. And so this guy is looking over what Stephen's entire speech is. He's paying attention to what Stephen's point is. And he says, look, the third part of Stephen's speech concerns the temple, because Stephen was charged with desecrating the temple. Okay, he was speaking against the temple, is what he was charged with. Now, that charge isn't true. And so finally he gets down to the brass tacks. Now he spends a lot of time going over their history. Okay, if he was charged with speaking against the temple and the customs of Moses, as if those were permanent features of Judaism. Now, Stephen's point, and we should probably go to Stephen's point here to understand what's going on here. You're going to get a little Acts tonight. You're going to get a little Exodus tonight. You're going to get the whole thing here. I'm going to go to God's True Tabernacle here. Okay. Now, Stephen is pointing something out. Okay. The temple and the tabernacle are not the same thing. See, Stephen is one smart guy when it comes to his Bible. Our fathers had the tabernacle in the wilderness, witness in the wilderness, as he appointed. That's God instructing Moses to make it according to the pattern he had seen. And we read that in Exodus, which our fathers, having received in turn, also brought with Joshua into the land. This is the tabernacle, whom God drove out, possessed by the Gentiles, who God drove out before the face of our fathers. I'm getting tongue-tied. Also, God brought Joshua into the land possessed by the Gentiles, who God drove out before the face of our fathers until the day of David, who found favor. Now, that's David finding favor. That's the grammar there, okay? David is finding favor, who is the relative pronoun there that goes back with David, who found favor. Okay. Kieran, that's the word face. It's a really weird word. It's like prosopone. Ton theo, the face of God. Okay. So, and asked him, now that's David. Okay. See, because the phone, who asked to find a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. Now, David wasn't allowed to build the temple. Solomon was. Solomon is quoting something here. But Solomon built him a house. However, the Most High does not dwell in temples made with hands. Now, he's not saying that the Most High does not localize himself or take form or come to be with his people. in temples made by hands. God doesn't, in and of his own nature, need a house. Okay, and now what he's going back to, we're going to see, is Solomon. So watch this. Okay, this is Solomon built a house, and we're going to go back to Solomon because that's what's getting discussed here. Okay, so he's cross-referencing back to Chronicles. All right. So what does Solomon mean by all this? First of all, the tabernacle which God constructed to be built so he could dwell among his people, take form and localize himself, is not the same as the temple. So Stephen's thing is Judaism changed. And guess what? Everything's changing again, guys. So why are you accusing me of going ahead and besmirching the temple when the temple was not the original tabernacle to begin with, but represents a divinely allowed change? Well, now we have to get back to our story here and see what Solomon is talking about. But before I do that, I got to get to the right slide. There we go. Okay. If these were permanent features of Judaism, but Solomon reminds his audience precisely these two features, a tabernacle and a temple, are at variance with each other. The temple was a change from the customs handed down by Moses. I'm not besmirching anything. This wasn't the original thing. God allowed it, which concerned a tabernacle built at God's direction. This was a change tolerated but not initiated by God. Stephen is no more against Judaism than the Jewish scriptures itself, as expressed through the prophet Isaiah, who he quoted. So let's look at what we've got here. Okay. Stephen's point is that there is a greater localization of God in the person of Messiah than there was in the temple, which was an allowance from the original tabernacle, which Messiah is still greater than. Okay, he's not guilty of defaming anything. He's pointing out that the ultimate realization of God's localization is in the person of Messiah. The fact that he mentions our father had the tabernacle wilderness means that Stephen himself has no problem with God localizing himself at all. Okay? Now here's back to our flow chart. We looked at an important set of verses that could be used to give indication that the language is absolutely metaphorical. Okay? And we looked at those verses to say if they really say that. Now, if those verses did say that the language had to be metaphorical, because here's two clear verses, then I'd have to conclude that the language was metaphorical, and that would bring me to this side of the chart. Okay? If the answer to that is no, then I get to move down the chart. Does the language indicate God taking form? Now, I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate those, but I want you to see that there's a rationale. Is the language actually historical? Do the decorations and furnishings giving detail indicate that? Are those directions there? Historically, do I get to tie the directions to God's dwelling in a more clear way? Okay, like, is there an indication? Now, I haven't gotten there, okay? If it were true, we need to build this argument, but if it were true, then Maimonides' view would undermine the Torah, because he takes the Torah literally, as being the actual word of God, but the word of God indicates something that he's not willing to believe. So his point of view would work against the Torah being what he states it is. Okay? Now, if the language does not indicate God taking form, then there's no undermining as far as the tabernacle is concerned. Okay? In other words, you could have the tabernacle in the temple, and you could have God unable to take form, and there wouldn't be any undermining there. Now, we have to develop how we get from the if yes to here, and why the if no is not a reasonable place to go. And we have a whole other question. So we're missing right here in the chart. So we have to have an if no, and we have to have an if yes. And so we go here. And so that's where we're sort of at this evening. What do we get from all this? Now, the 1A is in here. So you're going to see 1A, 2A, 3A, and then 1B, because we're on the yes side of the chart, and 2B. Okay? It would seem that looking at the main passage, that the language in that passage is not defeated. Now, that means that the language in the passage of God actually taking form is not counterindicated or eliminated by other passages that might seem to make the language metaphorical, but really doesn't, when they're taken in the understanding of their original context and they're taken the way things end up going. And so the prophet Isaiah is not saying that God cannot localize himself or take form, as we're going to see, because in Isaiah's life, God does take form. I should say, might see, because we're right here now. Okay? And so Isaiah's not saying that. Stephen isn't saying that. Solomon isn't saying that. What they're saying is that the fullness of God cannot dwell in all of its splendor in the tabernacle or in the temple. And so that's what essentially is being gotten at here. Now, there's some questions that came up. I hope I haven't lost them. Okay. The question came up, missed the beginning. Feel free to go back. That's why those are posted. Does dwell like abide? Wow. Well, the way I'm going to answer that question, okay, is by going to two verses. If I want to know two words are the same, one of the ways to go ahead and do that is to go to two verses. So what I'm going to do is use the awesome power of Logos, okay? And I'm going to put a verse in. Let the word of Christ dwell in you. Okay? Now, hopefully, my King James will live with this. I'll go here, okay? I don't want Revelation, though. I want the Paulinian epistles, okay? Because this is in Paul's writings, okay? And so I'm going to go there. And the reason I'm going to go here is because this will allow me to see the Greek, okay? And so now I'm going to highlight the word dwell. Isn't that cool? And there's the word dwell, okay? And the word dwell there is the ideal live or house, okay? Present active indicative, that's the word dwell. Now, the question is that like abide? So now I'm going to go to the branches there. Now that's a different Greek word. So I really want John 15. And I'm throwing a Bible study in here. But since I got asked the question, okay, and I'm trying to get to the part, if my word abides with you. Okay, abide in me. So there's our Greek. Let's close this. Okay. And there's our word abide. Now it should be meno. And it is. It's a form of meno. Okay. So now I click on this. Stay or reside. And I would say, even though they're two Greek words, there's an overlapping sense of meaning here. So the key may be in how it's nuanced. Here it seems to be remain in me or stay in me. Let the word of Christ be housed in you, from oikos. And so they have an overlapping concept to them, but there's probably a slight difference in emphasis here. And with some Greek words, they're so close that the difference in emphasis is difficult to show or to understand. Okay? Oops, I need to hide that. So that's probably my answer, is that there's overlapping meaning, both having the concept of remaining, but in the case of one, it seems to be being expressed differently. Where the case of meno, which is used in terms of remaining, it seems to be used differently. The idea here might be that the disciples are already beginning to identify with Christ and they need to remain in Christ. And so there may be a difference in nuance here, but that's basically where we're at. So overlapping concept, but probably difference in expression. And that's off the top of my head, just using Logos Bible software. Did any other questions kind of come up through this? By the way, you guys can also leave comments here. Was there something in this presentation you would have liked examined on that side of the loop? Because I'm very interested in what people have to say. Was there something a loop that wasn't asked? Maybe there's another question on that side of the chart that I didn't think of. Again, I will be going back and putting a link for that infographic. But we both dealt with technique, and we dealt with dealing with a modus talens sort of thing, where we eliminate possibilities that might bring us to the opposite conclusion, which would give us a reason to stay in the conclusion that does not allow the language to be metaphorical. And hopefully that was helpful and useful. It will be fun to examine whether the language warrants historically believing God dwelt there, and how we would deal with that. Do those historic connections and linguistic connections lead us to that? So that's where we're at. Elizabeth says Logos looks great. I was asked whether Logos costs. Logos is great. The engine you can have for free, but the problem is you'll have nothing to search. The packages contain the resources that you search, and they also end up coming with features such as creating a verse list, being able to highlight and create visual highlights along certain terms. So if I want to look up every command form in the Greek in Jesus's Sermon on the Mount, I could tick the imperative form of the Greek, and I could tell it to highlight purple every imperative in that, which becomes an excellent study tool for breaking down passages. Features like flow, workflows, guides, they all come with the packages. So you really don't want to just download the search engine. You want to get the packages. Now, a few other things to show you, different packages. You can talk to your local Logos representative. Just, be wise. Do understand that there are different types of packages depending on your particular interest in study. They have overlapping resources. You never pay for the same resource twice, but you do pay for it once. So it is something good to look into. It is a good Bible tool. That's my unpaid advertisement, unfortunately. So that is where we are at there. Any other comments or questions? Thank you, Michelle Turner, for being here. I appreciate your presence. If there's some new comments, that's great. Hi, Lindsay. Shout out to Lindsay. I'm sorry you were late. Guys, feel free in the public comments. Not only, I love your encouragement. Please don't stop your encouragement. I love it. But also, if there are things that you want examined along this, like there's some argument in here that occurred to you that did not occur to me, I will stick it in that flowchart. I will do it. And so that would be really great. So you are part of my feedback. You are the community, and you get to tell me, and I will be glad to deal and delve into a sideline that should be in that chart that is not. And I may have to revise that because I am learning too. I'm just thrilled to have Lindsay here. And it happens. I will be here tomorrow. And Lindsay, you may want to, I don't want to say you may want to tune in. We're going to look at Michael Root's timetable. Not to be rude. Not to be rude. Sorry about the pun. But to examine something that I think is a premise working in the back of his mind, and whether I can take the theological journey fully, or whether he would have to pave the road a little further for me to be able to drive it. So I hope that'll be a great program. It was Lindsay that had me watch the video, and once I watched the video, I got to kind of figure out what the person's saying, and then whether I can make the trip. So tune in tomorrow for an issue related to the Last Supper and John chapter 6, which I never would have thought there was an issue between the two, or related to both of them. And I will be front and center. I love it when you guys give me ideas. So blessing, praise God. Thank you so much, Lindsay. It makes me go back to the chalkboard. It makes me go back to the library. I just love it. And so I'm really excited about that. I think that brings us to about time where the sun is slowly setting in Arizona and the temperature is not cooling one little bit. But I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Remember, I will be going back in the comments in the description, and I will be making that flow chart available. It is not the end of the story, though. I will be revising it to streamline it as God moves me to make this a better tool, both for you and maybe even as far as dealing with heredity teaching, and helping to train people if they want to use it. So, greetings to my sister down under. We will probably learn more about Australian cooking and stuff like that. So, Brother Steve, thank you very much. Appreciate the comments. D. New, thank you for multitasking, as well as Slam RN, who had to do two things at once. And Slam RN said something really funny. I love it. She said it's always a good excuse to get back to the research. I heard it was 120. And yes, the outdoor outreach that I plan to do in the next week or so is going to require me drinking a lot of water. So you can be praying for my hydration and my being able to do a good job, and that my microphone, which is really cool, can stand the conditions. So that's for the prayer warriors there. And so I'm going to say Erev Tov and get a little bit of food. And Michelle says 120. Yeah, I can't believe it. It's the ick time of year. It is the ick time of year. Talk to me in like October and November. I will be happy. So, and Michelle is already being the prayer warrior. So that is great. Thank you so much. And I will see you hopefully tomorrow.